Hi, welcome to the Disability Cornwall podcast, which is Conversations with me, Theo Blackmore. And today I'm talking to two people from, I'll let you introduce yourselves. Perhaps you go first, Luke.
Okay, hi, my name's Luke Beasley. I'm the lead development worker at the Disabled People's Archive, which is based in Manchester.
Brilliant, thank you. And Ella.
Hi, I'm Ella. I'm the archive project worker, and yeah, I'm just going to apologize in advance. I think my emails keep popping off, and obviously this will be recorded, so you're a ding. Sorry.
Okay, I've turned my emails off, so there'll be no dinging from my side, but there we go. So thank you both very much for your time and for agreeing to do this podcast. The reason why I wanted to do the podcast with you in particular was because I just find it absolutely fascinating that you are creating a disability archive in Manchester as part of, I believe you're part of the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
Brilliant. So how long have you been doing this for? This is a good place to start, maybe.
Well, Ella, you're the veteran here, so do you want to take us off on that?
Well, veterans are a very kind way of saying I've been working here for a year. I started in 2022, and Luke started at the end of 2022, if I'm correct.
Late summer, August.
Yeah, and I started in January. But the project itself has been in the pipeline since about 2004, where a few members of GMCDP decided that it'd be good to create an archive of the disabled people's movement, maybe with a particular focus on Manchester, trying to get funding. A few avenues opened up. 2006, there was an independent survey done of some of the material that GMCDP had acquired. And I think in 2019, it was the official launch of the archive. And obviously with 2020 and the pandemic and lockdown starting, that kind of got pushed back. So then that restarted itself late 2021, 2022. So that's kind of where we are now. Do you have anything else to add, Luke?
Yeah, I think the decision, as I understand it, and Ella, jump in if I've got this wrong, but the decision to try and do a disability history project or a disability archive was really based around the fear of how much knowledge and expertise and how many stories from the movement were at risk of being lost. Around that kind of mid-2000 period, it became clear that disabled people's organizations were not as able to have the capacity that they had during the 90s and the early 2000s. And that, of course, only got worse over the austerity period. So it was a real attempt to kind of save knowledge, really, to kind of recuperate or really to preserve the skills and the expertise and the discussions which had already been had in the past and prevent those from kind of slipping away. And I feel like we kind of are trying to protect that knowledge, but also that kind of project and do as best we can through our work roles in making that as real as possible and making sure that all of that, really interesting and important stuff is available, not just for disabled people today to look at, to understand where they came from, but also to learn lessons from for their own projects and their own activism.
So that's really interesting. So you are the archive itself then is a national archive. So you collect data basically from all over the country, do you, or is it mostly Manchester, or is it all? I don't.
We're because we're housed at Central Library in Manchester, and we're a partnership with Archives Plus. Because of their accession policy, it has to have a Manchester or a Greater Manchester link for us to take it in. Now, when a lot of DPOs or other organisations in the country began sending their stuff to GMCDP, this was before we had anywhere to store it. So they've kind of not turned an eye away, but also just since that came in as the initial collection. So we do have some stuff from Birmingham. We do have some stuff that's We have journals from the United States. We have like a widespread of certain items, but if we were getting new acquisitions in and new accessions in, we couldn't take it unless it had a Manchester link. We do have quite a lot of stuff that's spread around the country nationally, so it is quite a national look, but realistically it's mainly Manchester Northwest.
You know, nationally that would be such a big project. It's a massive project, isn't it? If you were to be attempting to do that nationally. So I'm great. It's fascinating to hear that the archive is stored in the Central Library in Manchester. So in my mind, I don't know what exactly. It's a bit of an Indiana Jones. Do you open a big door and go in, and there's just like shelves and shelves of old material from across the area, really, across about disability history?
So
You'd be surprised at how accurate that is.
Very much so. So we share an archive space with all of the local archives. So Archives Plus in Manchester used to be the old County Records Office, which I'm sure is a little bit more intuitive. So all of the files from local, council services or council departments, but also local charitable bodies and civic organizations, trade unions, the Freemasons, whatever. That's all kept down there, as is all of our stuff. So you walk in and yeah, as you and Ella said, it's very Indiana Jones-ish, apart from it's probably much colder than the Indiana Jones films looked. So you go in, it's just kind of huge piles and piles of boxes and packets of material. And then all our colleagues from Archives Plus at the moment, will select that out to bring up to researchers. So mercifully, you don't have to spend a whole lot of time in the tomb style setup. You can go somewhere slightly more comfortable to read things, and things will be brought up to you.
It's amazing. So I think back to, I started up a couple of disabled people's organizations here in Cornwall back in the 1990s. And the 1990s, it's almost impossible to imagine it now, but it's a time when there was no internet. And there was a national organisation called ADAPE, the Alliance of Disability Advice and Information Providers, and I got information from them. I don't know how. And then I went and attended a conference in London, and I don't know how I found out about that. I guess they sent a newsletter out and stuff, and they produced lots of materials and lots of things. I mean, do you have old kind of paper-based materials from way back when, before the internet, I guess?
Do you want to go on this, Ella?
Yeah, most of our collection is pre-digital. It is a lot of newsletters, small peer groups that then developed into wider networks, like especially when you're looking at it from a Northwest, Greater Manchester look, we'll have a newsletter for one living centre in Oldham, and then they're having like the same conversations and ideas as another independent living centre further down the road in Manchester, but they're not connecting, and then they eventually connect, and then they maybe develop into something else. So you kind of see the development of DPOs quite early on, just through newsletters, just through information bulletins. So we've just been cataloguing journals and publications from disabled people's organisations, and the amount of work and effort that's obviously gone into it pre-internet, and whoever's got a printing press and whoever's got the local newspapers to take in stories and then comment on them, like you could tell a lot of work went into it. But yeah, a majority of our stuff's pre-digital, which then makes it very interesting to try and go through and transcribe and date and place. It's not exactly Googleable.
Yeah, brilliant. So, and that thing you just described there, which is like how one newsletter can lead to another DPO finding out information about another DPO, and then I guess making contact with each other so that they are then sharing their expertise, now then expanding. I mean, I wanted at one point I've done a DPO map of where DPOs are across the country, and I wanted to kind of do some sort of time lapse thing with it to see how and where they arrive and because there's been so many DPOs which have have come and gone over a period of time. It would be very interesting to plot it as a map so that it all comes into existence and lights come on where DPOs exist, and then they go out again if they cease to exist. But many of them stay aligned. I mean, that sort of way of sharing information, I guess, is really interesting for DPOs, and it's incredibly important for your archive.
Yeah, that job sounds terrifying to a certain degree, because as we know from the work that's been done by the National Service Users Network and the Reclaiming Our Futures Alliance, DPOs or user-led organizations of one kind or another are going out of existence seemingly every week at the moment. And I guess even updating the map to turn the lights off sounds like more or less a full-time job, and a very kind of depressing one at that. I mean, I entirely agree. Ella and I are both reasonably knowledgeable, we think, on the history of the movement. However, there are times even when we come up kind of slightly stumped when we find something. And we're very lucky in that we have a group of GMCDP lay members who support and supervise our project, who we can go to with any kind of questions. But it is really just a reminder of how kind of strong and active and varied the movement was back during its heyday, and even during periods of time where we don't necessarily think of the disabled people's movement being this kind of huge national force. You know, even in periods like the 80s, there was a huge amount of organization by disabled people, of disabled people going on. And it's been a real kind of eye-opener for us, I think, having an opportunity to go through that in much more detail. And we've got, you know, our collection dates back to the 60s. It deals with some of that kind of messy period where, are we looking at disability activism, or are we looking at disabled people effectively being manipulated by non-disabled people, right? But disabled people being active and being mobilized in some sense. And it's a real, I think it's a real kind of rich resource to look at that broad arc of how things happened, where they happened, why certain areas developed in certain ways and others didn't. But also for kind of, you know, we are very Greater Manchester focused, but also for looking at different trends within the national movement itself. So we are lucky enough to have a really rich collection, particularly of disability arts papers and periodicals, but also papers and resources from disabled LGBTQ plus groups in the 80s, and also the disabled feminist movement as well. And it's been really kind of just fascinating being able to look at how that developed over time, and also to kind of think about and pose those hard questions of, despite the fact that more disabled people will talk about, you know, feminist issues or LGBTQ plus issues today than they did at any other point in the past, we're still in a position where we don't have strong national lesbian, gay, bi, trans groups of disabled people nowadays, and we don't have strong national activist disabled women's networks. And to maybe try and figure out, you know, why that is, what was going on back in the day that we haven't been able to replace now.
You know, that's all really interesting. I do quite a lot of, I'm very interested in this whole notion of intersectionality. And you know, it quickly became apparent when I started doing this map that there was only really one, maybe two LGBTQIA organizations across the country which work with disabled people, and very few from minoritized ethnic groups. And that's just a real gap. And you're saying there was much more of a scene, as it were, back in the 80s. That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where did it go? It's really sad.
I think that's something we're all still trying to figure out to a certain degree. I mean, I guess, I don't know when and this is speculative, but one of the things we learned from other social movements is that when the national organizing structure is strong, then it's much easier for groups of marginalized people to organize within that, or even against it, right? I mean, I'm thinking about the women's liberation movement here in particular. women's lib was really strong because the trade union movement was really strong. And that doesn't mean that the trade union movement was always its friend. Often the women's liberation, they had to fight against the sexism of the wider workers' movement. But while it was there, it was something that you could use, you could engage with, you could demand things from it. And then when it disappeared, it was much harder for those feminist groups to recreate themselves. I suspect maybe something similar is true for the disabled people's movement, that once you lose, the British Council, the big national disabled people's self-organisation, whatever you think may have been wrong with it, but once you've lost that, it's much more difficult for groups who are even more excluded to be able to find a voice and find the resources they need to fight for their position.
Something that I'm really interested in as well is something you touched on a bit about why DPOs come into existence in the first place and where they come into existence. And I don't even know if there probably isn't an answer to why that is the case, but is a lot of it personality driven? So, for example, I mean, maybe a lot of the reason why these LGBTQIA organizations ceased to exist was because the people who ran them stopped running them and moved on, and there was nobody to take their place, as it were. Do you find that DPOs come into existence because there's a very strong personality or strong personalities in certain areas, or not necessarily?
So for my part, Ella, you may have a different view on this. So please let me know. If so, I think this is something that can go kind of two ways. I mean, you need strong personalities to build an activist group. You can't do it without them. But I worry sometimes that often we can tell the stories of movements as in like it's just led by great men or great women, and there's nothing to be said for wider organization. It's just these people were inspiring and got people to do things, and I think that that's probably not right. Like, one of the things which really comes out in our collection is that when things work, it's because there are any number of people doing really, really difficult work and thrashing things out together. My guess would be that things change over time, or things come into existence more to do with a lot of complicated local factors. So the particular difficulties that disabled people face in one area, but also how easy it is to move around within a city, what relationships were like with the local council or with the disability charities. Often that can play a real kind of triggering role into a disabled people's organization getting set up, or an activist network getting going, because people realize actually we're dealing with the same kind of problems caused by the same kinds of people. And you get kind of naturally pushed together by that. I think that's probably more common, although, having good leadership is something that you can't really do without. And if you start to lack it, then you are going to have problems of some kind or another down the road.
So you said a couple of things as well a bit earlier. So you said you used a word, and the word you used was the heyday. When was the heyday of the disability rights movement? Perhaps could you answer that, maybe, Ellie? You haven't heard your voice for a while.
I guess because Luke said it, maybe he has more of an idea of when the heyday was. But I think what's been interesting for me, before I started this role, I didn't really know about the disabled people's movement. I kind of learnt about GMCDP around maybe at the beginning of 2020, when I was looking for some support with the way that the pandemic was being handled, in particular to do with learning disability. And once I found GMCDP and realized that this is not just a recent organization, it's a heritage organization. They've been around for almost 40 years. And I'd not heard of it, and I'm interested in local history. I was a bit surprised. Maybe it's more of a comment on me than anything else. But I feel like just seeing the rise and the fall, and what the heyday is probably defined as that's probably got to do with strong national organizations, national demos, like people turning up and turning out and like getting responses, not just from like local councils, but from national government. So maybe the early 90s. I'm trying to think, when Dan was mostly active,
Sorry,
they
Dan.
got a lot of
Dan is
people on the
Dan.
streets.
Dan's an acronym, isn't it? What does it stand for?
Disabled people, no, Disabled Direct Action Network. I think I got it the wrong way around. Is it right, Luke? Dan is
yeah.
okay. I'm so used to talking in acronyms that I then start to mix my DANs and my DPACs and all my other great old acronyms up. But yeah, maybe the early 90s. I'm sure Luke has more of an idea since he said the word heyday, but I think because the disabled people's movement is quite a new social movement. It's newer than some of the others, and maybe it's because it's not been explored as much and the history's not as well known within mainstream like social movement history. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think heyday probably is in scare quotations to a certain degree, because depending on what you think the movement is for or is, will really depend on when you think it was the best version of itself. So there tend to be like two views of this, as I understand it. If you think that its job is to get the government to pass laws that you like and not pass laws you don't like, then you'll tend to think that the middle of the 1990s is probably when it was at its height, because that's when disabled activists had the most meetings with politicians and got the closest thing that we ever did get to anti-discrimination laws that were specifically about disabled people. And that's when you got direct payments and stuff like that. If you think that the movement is about disabled people taking control of the stuff that they use, whether that be the ways in which you get aids and appliances out to people and decide which ones work and which ones don't, whether that's around taking control of the means of support, so like the support that local councils provide, and running that for disabled people by disabled people, or whether you think that's disabled people kind of working out their own kind of priorities and kind of ideas in small groups. If that's what you think it's for, you'll probably think it's slightly earlier, kind of in the mid to the late 80s, which was when the British disabled people's movement was really heavily involved in international work with other groups of disabled people. It was when CILs were being set up that were not just about kind of an option amongst others, as in like, you need support, you can go to a CIL or you can go to this traditional charity, it's up to you, but were really about actually saying, no, there should be no disability services in this country which are not run by disabled people. And so depending on where your priorities lie really will depend when you think the heyday was.
And so you used another acronym there. You said CIL. What's the CIL?
Sorry, Centres for Independent or Integrated Living. My bad.
Great. No, don't worry. It's big question I've got for you. Have you got a copy of or the original fundamental principles of disability?
We have multiple, and some are a bit more damaged than others, but we have, I want to say, at least 6 copies.
Wow.
7 at my last count.
Okay.
Someone tried to give us one last week.
How come there's 6?
I think it just depends on, so we have so many depositors. So we have our obviously GMCDP. We got a lot of donations from DCODP, British Council of Disabled People, and then individuals who may have had a copy or had like clearing their attic out of some items that they thought might have been worthwhile. And then over time, we've just ended up with quite a few copies. We've got a lot of duplicates of the same thing. So 7 of the fundamentals. We'll have loads of different issues of different journals. So then now we're in the process of contacting the initial depositors to be like, we have a duplicate and this isn't a very good copy. Do you even want it back, or we could give it to someone else? So it's, yeah, nature of the beast of archiving, I guess.
So for people that may not be aware, the Fundamental Principles of Disability was a document that was written up as a result of a meeting between the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation and the Disability Alliance. And it's got one of the most important things in it. And that was a statement which led on to the development of the social model of disability. And it's seen as kind of the year zero, really, point zero of the disability rights movement, in that kind of conception of disability as a concept of power and as a political concept rather than as a medical concept. And I'm describing it badly, I think, but it's an incredibly important document, I think. And it's a document that perhaps lots of people might not be aware of, particularly younger disabled people might not have known about it. Do you think that younger disabled people know about that document and know about things like the social model of disability?
So in terms of the social model, and I think it might make sense to talk about different social models as opposed to just one. I think that everyone has a background awareness of it, because I think it's a thing that we push so hard as disabled people's organizations whenever we do anything, really, and for perfectly like good and understandable reasons. We say we want to separate facts about our bodies or our minds or whatever from the social position that we find ourselves in. We don't want to say that we're poor or we're excluded because in my case I'm severely visually impaired. We want to say that it's because the way society is organized, that's what leads to this. And because it's a social thing, then it can be changed if we get together and think about how we want things to work separately. And so at that very broad level, I think lots of people do have an idea about it. But of course, that is fleshed out by how and why you think society is organized in ways that exclude disabled people. And that's one of the things that was argued about a lot in the past. And the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, or UPS as I'll call them, they were one really, really important strand of that discussion. So they had a particular reading of why that was the case. And so in one sense, yes, younger disabled people have an idea about the social model. But if it's a question of, do they understand what different disabled people meant by it, or where people agreed and where they disagreed with each other, I don't think they do. On a complete aside, and this is not particularly DPA related, so feel free to edit it out. But I, with another hat on, did a talk last week around the social definition or the social model that UPS put forward, and comparing that to some recent stuff, some recent books that have come out. And this was to mostly British people and mostly disabled British people. And it became clear kind of quite early on that people either hadn't read this stuff, or if they had, they'd not read it on its own terms, if that makes sense. They'd read things that were current 20, 30 years after it was written back into it. And I think that kind of is a problem, because it means that we don't take all of the ideas as seriously as maybe they deserve to be taken. And I think that's particularly true for UPS. The Fundamental Principles document mercifully has been online for free now for, I think, maybe 10, 11 years, which hopefully, that also means that if people want to read it, and I agree with you, it's incredibly important, they don't necessarily need to get a train up to Manchester to have a look at it, although we'd be delighted to see them if that's what they do want to do. We've got plenty of other really exciting stuff that they can look at as well.
So how do people do it then? That's a really good lead into, how do people get into the archive? Do people just drop in, or do they need to make an appointment, and do they come to you, or how does it happen to people to access the archive? Is it open to anybody, or is it only for academics or for DPOs, or?
Well, to access it, usually you have to email either one of us or the archive@gmcdp.com email address, just because if you try and drop in, we'll need to have at least 24 hours notice to recall the items up from storage. Because we're still quite early in the cataloguing stages as well. That does mean a lot of the material that some researchers are looking for is embedded with some stuff that we've classified as red, not ready to be seen by the public yet, or amber, that has personal information on that we need to either doc or censor, so just to do a GDPR rather than anything else. But usually we've had a couple of researchers come up from different universities. We've had a few from Cambridge, some from Norwich, I think. But we're trying to make it so that anyone, regardless of if they are an academic or if they just have an interest in it, or if they want to just learn more and see some primary documents from the disabled people's movement, that they can come and talk to us. We're all very friendly, we don't bite. But with the way that the archives plus colleagues and the call up staff works, we need quite a bit of notice just to get it all together, get it all called up and get it ready presentable in the search room. It's a room that you can just look at archival stuff with. Usually can't take any water or bags in there, so and it's often people are under the impression that you need to use white gloves to look at some of the stuff. It's actually quite damaging to look at some archival material with gloves on. That's just for the very, very, very old stuff, which we're quite lucky to be mainly in the 80s, so we won't be doing too much damage by handling it. Yeah, but I know that, Luke, you've had like a lot of requests. You actually use the DPA archive before you got a job here. So
yeah, no, I poacher turned gamekeeper. So I think, Ella, that was a pretty brilliant kind of description of how people access it in person. We have a couple of other little ways that we make stuff available. So because of the age of a lot of the items we have, many, although not all of them, fall outside of copyright laws, because they were produced either by individuals or small groups that just don't exist anymore, and the people who wrote them are very sadly no longer with us. So there are some researchers who we got some researchers who have conditions which mean they're particularly made vulnerable with the current COVID response, basically. And so if items are copyright free, we'll just scan them for them and send them in those over email. So that is something that we can do. We would ask anyone who wants to request any of our items be digitized, to only request that if it's an access issue, if it's impairment related. Because if we were to do it for everyone, just as a matter of course, we do nothing apart from scan documents all day. We need to get the physical collection going strong. We also publicly release digital copies of items in accessible formats, so screen reader friendly formats, easier to read versions, etc. Now that's quite a long job to do for any single document, and so the pace of that is not rapid. We have a reasonable turnaround. It's not an immediate one. And we're going through old papers by members of the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, which have been unavailable for 30 or 40 years. And we're also doing it with Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People's Coalition magazine, which was a very widely read social movement journal and mag back up until the 2010s. So we're going through the back catalogue and getting all of those translated into easier to read and having screen reader accessible versions of those. So those are the other ways that we make our collection available to people if they're not in a position to come up to Manchester, as lovely and sunny as it is.
So goes on to the question then, how much stuff have you got? I don't know how you begin to answer that. You sent me 3 folders, Excel spreadsheets. with literally hundreds, thousands of documents in there. I don't know how many you've got. How would you even count that or quantify that in total? But some kind of idea, how big is your archive?
So archives tend to be measured in linear meters, so a meter's length. And ours, Ella, I want to say 135. Does that sound right to you?
It was 130 when it was first accredited by an independent source, but I feel like since then we've like got more stuff since then. I also think that doesn't include like the posters we have or the other types of material that does take up more space than just the boxes themselves.
So that's
So I guess an
100,
estimate.
130 meters of boxes, that is then.
No, of contents if they were all laid out on the floor. So if you took everything out of the box and laid it on the floor, it would be 135 meters long. So yeah, it's certainly a jog.
A lot of stuff.
A huge amount.
That's amazing. And you said earlier that it's mostly from the northwest and from the Manchester area. So do you have big gaps in your archive of areas of the country perhaps that you might want more information from?
Scotland.
Okay.
And Wales, actually. Those are the two areas where we don't have a huge amount of publicly available material. So in particular, the magazines and newsletters that DPOs or disabled activists put out, or pamphlets, leaflets from different campaigns or something like that. That's an area that we would like to develop a bit more of. There are certain kind of time periods in certain places as well, which aren't quite as well represented as others. So we will know kind of from the people on our steering group or people we know that disabled people in, say, Bristol or in Birmingham were really active and really busy, at some time in the early 90s, and we just don't have anything from there. So we're trying to plug in those kind of little gaps as well.
This is absolutely astounding. I'm in awe. So is it important? I know that Leeds, for example, does a disability archive. They have stuff online, and I'm sure that other universities do as well. How important is it that the archive that you have is held by a disabled people's organisation rather than an academic organisation?
I think for me, it's because it kind of echoes the famous saying, nothing about us without us. And I do feel like there is not necessarily a big divide between how academics understand disability and speak about disability and present disability history, and how organizations of disabled people and average disabled people experience and speak about history. I think they're both valid, but I think to really create outreach and support and enrich the lives of disabled people in Greater Manchester, it'd be important for them to have access to their history that isn't maybe behind paywalls or behind academic jargon. It's stuff that average disabled people in their area did to make the changes that they see today, and they can view the images or view the notes of a meeting and have a structured and spoken about experience with these artifacts rather than the kind of academic build-up of the history, which I think it does inform some of what we do, but I feel like we're taking it from disabled people at the time making it, not thinking this is going to be published in a journal somewhere and peer reviewed. It's more about on the ground work of what disabled people are getting up to. And I just feel like with the archive itself as well, I think it's really powerful that this is a history by the people and for the people of Manchester, no matter what their impairment or if they are disabled. It's to kind of bring the social movement to light and bring this social movement that is kind of a hidden history. A lot of people don't assume that, people know about the women's movement, people know about the LGBTQI movement, people know about the Black and Asian movements, but they don't really know much about the disabled people's movement. And why is that? Is it because it's been maybe shrouded in academic circles? Is it because lots of local disenfranchised disabled people can't understand or get their history because it's unaccessible? So those are like the things we're hoping to try and change. But that's not to disregard the academic side of it. I know a lot of people that access our archive are academics, and Luke is an academic, and we have a lot of academic help. I feel like that might have sounded a bit shady, but that wasn't my intention. I feel like I maybe said that wrong.
Yeah, not at all.
I felt you could have gone further. I was waiting for the real barbs there. I was looking forward to them. I think just to because I couldn't agree more with what Ella just said. There's one thing though I kind of want to stress. It's not just like us as disabled people or as Greater Manchester Coalition who are thinking about owning our own archive. There's a really long tradition of this, right? So like women's libraries or women's archives, we've got some in Glasgow and Liverpool in this country. And also anti-racist archives and Black archives. There are several down in London. And you know, working class movement archives, trade union archives, anarchist archives, all that kind of stuff. All share this kind of really basic belief about what their history is for. And it's not just to kind of be recorded and celebrated, or it's not just to be poured over in detail so that, you know, we really understand it or something like that. It's about the future as much as it's about the past, right? And it's about using this stuff as a way to inform how we struggle today and what we struggle for and how we make decisions and how we design the world that we want to live in, even in the kind of darkest moments of the present. And that belongs in a social movement. That doesn't belong in an academic ivory tower. That has to be a democratic process, and that has to be informed by the needs and the wants and the ideas of people who are involved in those battles today. And that's kind of no problem at all with the academic archives. You know, God bless them. The fact that they were able to take all those old documents and put them online for free, that's brilliant. But sometimes we need to have real conversations about, you know, what is our history for? How do we use it today? How do we bring as many people as possible into it? And I think that can only really be done in democratic organizations and amongst people who first and foremost want to change the world, not just understand it.
Yeah, I think there's a real power of it being located at the DPO level, because I'm very interested in this idea of the DPO sector as a specific sector. And I think that we as a sector are distinct from other sectors. We're a part, it's almost a subset of the voluntary sector, but we have got very specific issues and there's very specific things which apply to the DPO sector that don't really apply anywhere else. And I think it's therefore very important for us to understand ourselves and to see where we've come from and to begin to kind of forward think it a bit and think where we might go to. I was in a meeting recently, I got funding for a project, and the project was called Disabled People's Organisations Sharing Experiences During COVID. And during one of the meetings, we were asked as a group of organisations, and there were not only DPOs there was DPOs and other sort of people, organisations led by leaders with lived experience. So we were asked what would help your organisation thrive into the future. And for the DPO sector, a lot of that is about core funding. But the key question for me was that word thrive, and what does that mean? And you touched on it there, Luke, when you said about depends on how you view DPOs and what we're for and what we do. Because certainly back in the 1990s, when I was first kind of involved in the sector, you know, my vision really or my understanding of what organizations might be and might do was kind of much more about sort of social capital, bringing people together, and cultural capital, bringing together different understandings of disability, and artistic capital, so people sharing artistic knowledge and all of that kind of stuff. It wasn't really about service delivery stuff. and we much more are about service delivery now as DPOs than we ever were in our past. But for me, a thriving sector is a sector which is diverse and represents everything for everybody. So it's not only about delivering local authority services, it's also about delivering a really vibrant arts sector, and it's also really about delivering stuff for various intersectional groups within the sector. I could go on about it for hours, but a little bit incoherently probably as well.
No, I think that's right. And I think there's an element as well of, is it a sector which does things for, or is it a sector which mobilizes people to do things themselves? And I think there's a real back and forth on that, right? Like within the history of the disabled people's movement, how much of this has to be about getting almost like the groundwork in place, like the brickwork, and say, okay, this is what needs to happen for disabled people to take a greater part in society. And it's only going to be maybe a few of us working with the government doing it for now. But the important thing is that we can get all of that stuff in place that we need, direct payments, anti-discrimination legislation, kind of whatever, or particular services in the community. And how much of it is going, well, look, this is never going to be perfect, but the important thing is that we steer it from the ground up. Yes, it might take a bit longer, but as long as disabled people are learning the skills to manage their lives and their societies for themselves, that's more important than anything else. And I think maybe sometimes even in the academic debates around the history of the movement, that gets missed because they're not looking for it. Like, to understand that tension, you kind of have to be pretty deeply involved in disability politics and have that as a question which comes up for you practically every day. And I think that's one of the things that our collection kind of captures really, really well. And one of the things that we've been working with researchers to bring back into discussions which are going on today, and to try and inform those debates today, which will come up whatever happens, but inform them with how people spoke about it in the past, and try and enrich the ideas and the strategies that are going around today.
It's a great book. When are you going to write the book?
That's someone else's job, mate, above my pay grade.
Above your pay grade. No, but I mean, it would be a great book, because I remember a lot of the disability rights movement was very visual, and it was all, when I say write the book, I mean collate a book, because there'll be lots of pictures in it and lots of posters and all of the kind of the nothing about us without us, and the old, lots of images even from the old, the riots against the telephone and all that kind of stuff back in the 1980s.
I think that's your project, Ella, the pictures and the cool aesthetic stuff.
I'm actually working on something at the minute to try and get a bit of a structured plan, because we do have quite a lot of photos, and we have a lot of posters and mainly visual artifacts from the movement, but scanning them in and getting them image described and getting them alt texted and getting everything ready to either go online and to have like an online catalogue, as well as have them physically looked after, because some of these photos have just been chucked in a box and have been squashed. So, not photoshopping them, but just restoring the image a little bit. So we have got the Telethon 82. We have a lot of people throwing themselves in front of police cars. People trying to be lifted into police cars, but the police vans aren't wheelchair accessible, so loads of coppers looking a bit confused.
Yeah, that would be, what a brilliant book that would be. A brilliant visual archive. And so when we talk about, archive, the word itself is about the past, but it stretches into the future in my mind as well. An archive also has a reach into the future. And you did mention the Direct Action Network earlier, Dan, but you also mentioned DPAC, the Disabled People's Action Network. Was that Disabled People's Action Network?
Disabled People Against Cuts.
Sorry, that's exactly what it is. And that's kind of taken over the mantle in many ways of Dan, because they do a lot of direct action. They're very grassroots and they're very unfunded, underfunded, and it's very much about a kind of a groundswell of activity. I mean, I can see that growing very much out of an archive like this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting things, I think, is that we almost are kind of opened to all of the trends that you get within disability politics. And so we do have, as Ella pointed out, like huge amounts of direct action stuff. In fact, we've got some copies of a little pamphlet that was written by the artist Liz Crow in the late 80s, early 90s, I forget the exact date, where she basically just goes, what is direct action for? How do we do it? What do we need to think about? And it's almost like it was published by the Greater Manchester Coalition, and I think sent around to lots of places around the country. And it was the first time that people were trying to think through, you know, what are the protest tactics we use? What are the pros? What are the cons? And that led to a lot of discussion and arguments. And so we have a lot of things like that. And there are certainly, I think, things which can, you know, inspire and help direct maybe some of the direct action protests that are going on nowadays. We also have a lot of the more, I don't know, respectable stuff as well, a little bit. So we've got, you know, details on, you know, from different organizations and activist networks on, you know, here's how to write a letter to your MP, or here's
the legislative side of it. Let's say that rather than the.
Yeah, I think that's fairer. But the more kind of standard, you know, activist in your local area, getting a petition together, you know, negotiating with the train provider, lots of minutes of meetings where people were talking about how to make the buses more accessible, the trains more accessible in Bury or in Oldham or something. And so we have kind of all of that stuff at different places within our archives. And it is kind of, you know, it is great to focus on that really like vibrant, exciting stuff where you see disabled people taking real risks and throwing off this label of, you know, being vulnerable and having to wait to have things done for them and needing to be protected, because you don't seem all that vulnerable when you're chaining yourself to a bus, you know, or being ripped off of it by coppers. But we also, it's also really interesting to know, you know, what happened with the other side of things. You know, where was it that polite letters were really successful? Where did they fail? Well, where were the limitations of both approaches? And I think it's almost the kind of combination of the two, to being able to see how they come into tension with each other or how they fit together, that's been really, really fascinating from where I'm stood, because that's how you see how a movement develops overall over time.
So that's amazing. It's amazing that the archive is where it is and that you're doing the work that you do. An obvious question is that your focus is largely going to be in the Manchester area. We need more of these things, don't we? We need one in the southeast, maybe one in the northwest. We need them everywhere. Northeast rather. We need them in the southwest. We need these archives everywhere, because there's a whole load of stuff. You know, you've got 130 meters. We wouldn't get, I don't know if we'd get 130 meters down here in the southwest, but we would get meters.
You guys, I don't know about Cornwall so much, but a lot of the DPO history in the southwest is already held at local authority archives. So it's available. I guess the issue is disabled people don't necessarily have a say over how it's used or how it's adapted. I mean, I you know, it may be an idea if any DPOs have the time and capacity to maybe start thinking about how they could work with those local authorities to get that stuff out and get that, you know, in an adaptable form. I agree, the more we have of these around the country, really, the better. We know that the disability arts scene is running their own archive at the moment, which is great. That's based down in Buckinghamshire. But the you know, trying to do everything by a national setup does have its pitfalls, and that is that regions will be underrepresented because you know, either things didn't make it out, or it was very easy for things to get lost, or even if we get it, we might not understand the local context particularly. It's very easy if you're in Manchester or you're in Bristol to find someone who can tell you about what was going on in Manchester or Bristol during the 80s or 90s. It's much more difficult for someone to tell you what was going on in Inverness or Belfast or the Vale of Glamorgan or something like that. So yeah, more of these things locally would be absolutely amazing to see. Some organizations have their own kind of heritage projects, which are really good. So Spectrum down in Southampton and Hampshire, they do some really, really great work on digitizing their own history, which we've used a lot for research materials when we're trying to figure out what was going on at a certain period of time, so we can put it down for the cataloging notes. And others are perhaps a bit more recent, and so don't have that opportunity. But in general, it's something that we'd like to see kind of increased and improved across the movement as it is today, although we understand and fully respect all of the challenges which go along with that, because, you know, we're lucky enough to kind of be paid to do this for a living. And our colleagues at the Greater Manchester Coalition, you know, did this as volunteers for like 10 years maybe. And it's a very, very difficult job to do without all of the luxuries of time, of an archive building, of support from Archives Plus that we have.
So listen, that's great. That's an hour out of your lives. Thank you incredibly much for that. There's the $60 million question, of course, at the very end of it is, what did I not ask you that I should have asked you? Is there anything that I've not said that, or anything you wanted to say that I didn't give you a chance to say?
Ella, is there anything from you?
I feel like the main honcho questions were covered. You can find us online, archive@gmcdp is our email, with the disabledpeoplesarchive.com online. That's all that I can think about adding in at this time. Do you have anything, Luke?
I do have one thing, which is for our digital holdings, particularly on the Disabled People's Archive website, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the access adaptations are good and high quality. But within our team, there isn't the range of impairments that would allow us to have lived experience of the difference between, you know, a technically okay adaptation and one that's actually good. So if you are a screen reader user, if you use easier to read, or you know people who use easier to read, if you tend to be a large print user, please, if you're interested in what we have, go onto the website, have a look at the material there. And if the adaptations aren't as good as you would like them to be, please do email us and we'll find a way to get those fixed. We often kind of, we do these because it's super important to get them as accessible as possible, but we are always open to improving with feedback. So if that sounds like you and you are interested in the movement's history, please do have a look, please do get in touch if it's not quite up to spec.
Absolutely marvellous. Thank you very much, Luke and Ella from the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People's Disability History Archive. I wish you all the best. Stay safe.